Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, a name that makes you feel smarter just by saying it. Hello, everybody. This is Gilgamesh. And on this channel, we talk about the Hebrew Bible and its impact on our culture and our society. And today we're going to talk a little bit about what kind of texts we use when we study the Hebrew Bible. And this is perhaps the most famous and most useful one. We lovingly call it BHS. This is my personal copy that I've had for a very long time. You can see it is quite well loved, and I try to be very gentle with it. It has served me well for many, many years. Rather than trying to focus a camera on these pages, I've got a PDF that we'll actually use to look at it. Today's episode is going to be a little bit geared towards those who are actually Hebrew students, particularly the beginning and intermediate level. But if you have an interest in how textual scholarship of the Hebrew Bible works, this may still be very enlightening for you. We're not going to do a whole lot of reading of Hebrew, but we are going to look at the crazy code that you must learn if you wish to use a critical text version of the Hebrew Bible. Hopefully this will be a little bit interesting if you're not studying Hebrew, and hopefully it'll be kind of useful if you are. So to talk about this, BHS, Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, it is the fourth major edition of the Biblia Hebraica series. It was published by the German Bible Society between the years 1967 and 1977. Yes, there was a 10-year publishing process to get this to print. And they talk about some of this in the introduction, where they talk about that the old typeface wouldn't work, and some of the plates that were used to publish the third edition had been broken, and so they had to kind of start all over again. They also made a hard commitment to portraying the Codex Leningradensis B19A, or as any normal person calls it, the Leningrad Codex. This is a manuscript that was penned about 1008 Common Era. Now, you may have already noticed that this thing has a Latin name that includes a German city. It's based on a codex with a Latinized Russian name of a city in it, and that city is no longer called Leningrad anymore, and the text itself was written in Cairo, Egypt. So this gives you an idea of just how mixed up and messed up this whole process is. Let's talk a little bit about the text that it's based off of. BHS is what's called a diplomatic text. That is a text that is based on a specific manuscript. In this case, the Leningrad Codex. It is the oldest complete codex of the Hebrew Bible that we have. There's one major competitor for it, and that is the Aleppo Codex. But unfortunately, in the 1940s, there was this riot in Aleppo, and a good portion of that manuscript was destroyed, and the previous caretakers were very cautious about it and did not allow it to be photographed before that point, meaning that those destroyed portions are lost forever. It included almost all of the Torah. The rest of it has, through a bit of cloak and dagger, wound up in Israel. And there is actually another project, which I'll mention a little later, that's trying to do something similar for the Aleppo Codex as what BHS does for the Leningrad Codex, at least what is left of the Aleppo Codex. But the Leningrad Codex itself, very nicely penned, excellent handwriting. It is mostly a simple 3-column display of the Hebrew Bible, although they have fun in certain areas of it, introducing all sorts of unique formatting and some illustrations and just some lovely carpet pages that are found in the volume as well. And these are highly illustrated pieces of artwork, really. And unfortunately, none of this is preserved in BHS. So I show you here to get you an idea of what the original looks like that we're discussing here that they used to make BHS. Most of the issues of formatting were left behind. They were much more concerned with trying to preserve the text of the manuscript than they were the formatting. And so that was a consideration there. And we'll look at some of the things they did with that. If you are interested in getting a copy of BHS, you can find it online easily. There are hardcover and softcover editions. The softcover editions are very cheap now. When I bought mine, I think I paid like $80 for it back a very long time ago when $80 was a lot of money. And it's an investment I do not regret at all. I have had much more joy out of that book than what I spent acquiring it. But I acquired it as a student when I was first studying, and it has served me well since. I have several copies now, including some of the paperbacks that are out there. They're all fine, and you can find them probably as cheap as $20 or $30 these days. So they've come way down in price from when I first got mine. If you don't want to go that route, but you just want to see what it looks like, you can go to archive.org, where you will find a copy of the BHS available to freely download as a PDF, along with 2 books that explain how to use it. Now, the shortest of those books was 96 pages long. This gives you an idea of how complicated this book is to use. It's maybe the most complicated book that I own because it's a bit like reading in code. And for a while, this was viewed as something that really only serious scholars did. And they almost made it purposefully hard. But there came out a couple of books that tried to explain and break down exactly how it worked, because in the very early days, it was really just word of mouth. You had to find somebody who already understood how to use the book to even figure it out. But there's obviously more than I can do in a short video here. But I want to mention that there are a couple of other attempted efforts to make a critical text of the Hebrew Bible, and they've all kind of fizzled. This right now is really the only game in town, with a major exception, and that is the 5th edition, known as Biblia Hebraica Quinta, which has been coming out and is majorly delayed. They were hoping to have it completed sometime in the 2010s. Now they're projecting sometime in the 2030s that it will be completed. It has 9 volumes that are currently out that cover a significant portion of the Hebrew Bible. I will talk about it a little bit at the end of this video as another alternative. Well, let's start at the beginning. If you look in the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, the BHS, you're going to find very helpful that there's a whole introduction written in Latin. And this is great for people who study Hebrew and not Latin. They also use cryptic symbols to represent things. 3 little loops represent the Samaritan Pentateuch for some reason. There are Greek letters that represent different witnesses. There are fancy Gothic-looking letters that represent different textual witnesses. And so there's this whole code as to what was actually being intended throughout the book. And it's helpfully defined for you in Latin. They also make extensive use of abbreviations, and the abbreviations are all Latin. And so we have constant Latin abbreviations through this whole process. You're going to have to learn what some of those mean, at least the most common ones, and then you're probably going to have to look up the rest. They helpfully have here the Latin abbreviation spelled out for you with the long form of the Latin. So yeah, that's what you're getting to deal with. They go on, and there is also a series of notes from the Masoretes. And I should pause here for a moment and mention who the Masoretes are. The Masoretes are a group of scribes that created the Leningrad Codex. They had not only the text that they were preserving, but they added in vowel points and accents to try and precisely indicate how the text was to be read. These are not ancient, but they are their understanding of what was passed down as to how it should be read. They also made a series of notes in the margins and at the bottom of the page known as the Masora. Masoretes, Masora, they go together. There are actually 2 divisions to these notes: the small Masora, or the Masora Parva, and the big Masora, or Masora Magna. And the Masora Magna is the one that's at the bottom of the page. The Masora Parva is the one that's on the side of the page. But these have all sorts of things that are mostly of interest to the scribes, although some of them are definitely of interest to anyone who's interested in the Hebrew Bible, because they often contain what the scribes saw as probable corrections to the text, where they knew the text was wrong, but they did not wish to alter the text. So they would make notes in the margins saying, this probably should read this. If you're already thinking, my goodness, this sounds terrible, they do have a helpful dictionary here that translates common Latin words into both English and German. So the process is you see an abbreviation in Latin, you look it up in the index of abbreviations, get the full Latin word, then take the full Latin word, look it up in this, and then find the English or German equivalent, and then suddenly you know what it says. It's an ugly process. And these books that I mentioned that come in a PDF format that you can also get from archive.org, they help shortcut a lot of this process by giving you directly definitions in English of the Latin abbreviations, as well as definitions in English of the various sources that are represented by the different symbols. Definitely check those out. They make life a lot easier than this mess of an introduction makes for people. As we go into actually looking at what the text looks like, I just picked a page at random, and the page that I picked happened to be Genesis 18. And this is what Genesis 18 looks like in the BHS. And you can see there are a couple of different sections to the text. The first and most prominent section is the text itself. I highlight it here with a blue rectangle. This is the actual Bible. Now, the consonants are ancient. This is what has handed down anciently. All the small little dots and squiggles around the consonants, those are vowels and musical markers that were added by the Masoretes to try and define precisely how this was to be read. Also should mention here just for a moment, the concept of a codex. It was very popular at this time to write on pieces of parchment or paper and then bind them on one side, much like we would call a book. That's basically what a codex is. This is not a scroll. For religious purposes, the scriptures were still written on large scrolls that were wound around two sticks. And this is still what would be used in religious services. And those would not have any of these extra dots or marks on it. It would have only the consonantal text. As they wished to study more intently, they copied it onto these codices, and they added in all of their marginal notes, all of their vowels, all of their musical notations to help people understand what it was. And so this was the format for study rather than for religious use. And that's part of what makes this such a valuable book, is because they have been meticulous in how it was transmitted, and it gives us a lot of information about their transmission process. And so we have the main text here. And then on one side here, you notice a series of numbers. These are verse numbers. And because it is written like continuous paragraphs, they put the verse numbers on the inside column. So this will switch between left to right, depending on if you're on an even or odd page. These verse numbers here allow you to quickly scan down the page. And then as you scan across the line, you will find the number where the actual beginning of the verse occurs. And so this is an easy way to look at it. They also have enlarged numbers for the chapters, so you can easily find those as well as at the top, there's a little heading there to tell you what chapter and verses span this particular page. As we look at the right side, I have here in a purplish rectangle what is known as the Masora Parva. This is the small Masora, and it is full of scribal notes, most of which are statistical information. How many times does this word occur? Sometimes it is brief explanation about some of the grammatical issues of it, and occasionally it does pull out what they believe were scribal errors in the text, indicating what they think the correct reading should be. Sometimes it even contains some bit of debate back and forth between different scribal schools as to exactly how a particular verse should be read. And so mostly this is of interest only to a small group of scholars, with the exception of a particular type of note that we'll point out later. A lot of what they did is truly amazing. They could do it without the aid of computers. They are familiar with how many times each particular individual word occurs, not just in the book they're dealing with, but often throughout the entire Hebrew Bible. They have counted and numbered them, and this provided a level of precision that they could check the accuracy of their work. Then down at the bottom here, the first section below the text itself is a series of references that you'll see they all have a capital M and a lower m by them, usually then followed by a number. This is the Masora Magna, which is what those two m's stand for, and the number references you to a whole other book. And that whole other book will help you find the footnotes that are sometimes referred to in the Masora Parva that give you more statistical information about these words. It was considered too much to include in BHS itself, so it was published as a separate volume. Very few people dive into this. In the age of computers, it's very easy to do searches and find exactly where things are found. And so this information was very helpful in the time before computers, but has largely become obsolete now. It's a bit like a rudimentary concordance, but it's very old in its usage. Then below that, I have here a red rectangle. This has what's called the critical apparatus. This is perhaps one of the most useful parts of BHS. What this is the scholars who put together BHS, because they used a diplomatic approach and based everything on the Leningrad Codex, they then wanted to talk about every other major source out there and how it differs from the Leningrad Codex. So the idea here is that you start off with one ideal source, and then you discuss how things are different in every other source. And you must realize that before the printing press, when everything was hand copied, no two lengthy documents were ever precisely the same. It's nearly impossible to do. Try it sometime. Take a chapter of your favorite book or even a chapter of the Bible itself and try to copy it precisely. Get all the punctuation and capitalization the same. Get everything so that it is an exact copy. You will find it is an extremely hard process. The scribes who did this were extremely disciplined, and they had a lot of checksums and things that they would use, and they still were not perfect. We have no two copies that are precisely the same. And so the question is, were the differences important? Were they significant? And so they tried to focus on the most significant differences, and they look at it in a variety of sources, not just Hebrew sources, but also sources like the Greek Septuagint, the Samaritan Pentateuch, which was a competing copy of the 5 books of Moses. They look at the Targum, which was an early translation into Aramaic. They look at early Syriac translations and several others, including the Latin Vulgate and a few others. All of those are examined, and where they differ significantly from the Leningrad Codex, they get noted down here in the critical apparatus. Unfortunately, reading it is a matter of deciphering code. Before we get into that, though, let's zoom in just a little bit on what we have here at the beginning of chapter 18. I have here an expanded picture of what I've got circled in this small blue circle here, and you will see that there is the Hebrew letter Samech along with the Hebrew numerals for 15. This Samech stands for the word Seder. And there were two competing ideas of how to divide up the Hebrew Bible before the days of chapters, before chapters were really invented. The one group that was centered around Tiberius in Israel came up with a system of Seders where they divided the entire Hebrew Bible into 452 individual sections or lessons. The exact location of where they divide up sometimes differs a little bit from manuscript to manuscript, but this is one of the ways that they divided it up. Now, the other way they divided it up was based on a group over in the Babylon area that divided it up into Parshot or a Parsha. So that is what we see here with the Pei Reshin. There indicates that this is the start of a new Parsha. And this only exists in the Torah, and there are 54 sections under the Parsha system. This is probably the more popular way that it is still used today is through the Parshot, but that is what these are indicating here, is that this happens to be not only the modern chapter division of chapter 18, but also a Seder division and a Parsha division. And so that's what these letters are indicating over here. If we look at the original Leningrad Codex, we can see that these symbols also existed in the original text. One of them is kind of a thin-looking Samech, which is over on the right-hand side of the column, and the other is a nicely pinned Pei Resh Sheen over on the left-hand side with a little bit of colorful wording around it. This is the indicators that we have in the original and are represented here rather simply in the BHS to let you know that it's happening. But this is the way it was brought across. So the artistry is gone, but the information remains. I did note over here, this is chapter 18. We have a nice large 18 there that helps us understand that. Above that, there is this letter Pe that is on a line by itself. This is not representing a letter that was in the Leningrad Codex, but it is helping us understand its formatting. The letter Pe is one of two kinds of paragraph markers that exist in the BHS. This one means an open paragraph, meaning that text drops to a new line at this point. There's the other kind that is represented by a samach, which indicates that there is simply a space on the line, and then the text starts up again on the same line. That's considered a closed paragraph. So you will have Pes and samachs present in the BHS to help you understand what the formatting of the Leningrad Codex was, but these were added by BHS to preserve that, and they are not original to the codex that they're representing. Now, if we zoom in a bit here around this 18, we can see a bit more detail as to what's happening. And you will notice that above certain words, there are small circles. Sometimes this small circle or circlet is directly above the word. Sometimes it is between two words. These correspond to Masoretic notes in the Masora Parva. The Masora Parva is a series of Aramaic notes that are largely abbreviations. You can tell they're abbreviations because they have a dot above the letter, which is how they indicated an abbreviation. And for each of these, it corresponds with a particular note, and when there's more than one note on a line, they separate the notes with a dot between the notes. And so you can have multiple notes on a single line that correspond over to these small circlets. Most of these notes are fairly unimportant. The first one there indicates that this is something that happens 9 times, that this word shows up 9 times. Then below that, we have a note that says that this word shows up 4 times when it is spelled defectively. And it also, you will notice that those 2 notes both have a 1 and a 2 next to them. If we were to go down to the footnotes at the bottom for the Masora Magna, it would tell us where to look those up, and it would give us the exact references for where those occur in the Masora Magna. The other one here that is between 2 words here, saying he lifted up his eyes, it says that this occurs 5 times. And this is just basic Hebrew numerals here that they use to indicate these things. The last note there indicates that this exact form occurs twice. So this is what a lot of the Masoretic notes are. They're sort of like checksums to make sure that the scribe got everything correct. If we look at the original text, we can see that they reflect fairly accurately what we see in the text. You can see here the one that is in orange is reflected on the original manuscript here, and we have the small circlet that is right above the word, and it connects over to a margin in the side that, well, in the original text it was on 2 lines, and in the BHS it's on a single line. That kind of formatting doesn't preserve, but we have pretty exactly what is in the margins of the original text preserved here in BHS. Now, this next bit, I actually had to flip to a different page because there wasn't an example on the page that I wanted to start with here. And so I went ahead and found a different page, and this one's in, this must be chapter 39 in Genesis, if I remember correctly. And here we have the word for prisoners of the king. And it seems to be spelled wrong. It's got a vav where we would expect to have a yod. And so this is an example here of the marginal note. And this one's formatted a little specially. It's formatted with the correction on top, and then below the letter kof with a dot above it, standing for hire, meaning what is to be read. So it is written one way, but you read it the other way. And the vowels, if you look closely, those are not the normal vowels you would expect to see with those letters. The vowels go with the letters that should be read, not the ones that should be written. So it's a little confusing, but this is the way it was done. So when you see one of these notes, this is saying that there is a scribal correction. There is something wrong with the consonants. And so over in the margin, they will put what they believe are the correct consonants for this. They think that the yod was accidentally turned into a vav, and the vowels under the word will go with the consonants that are in the margin, not the word that is actually there. That's a little confusing, isn't it? If you're reading most any electronic version of the Hebrew text, they simplify this a lot for you by having the corrections there side by side with the original, often indicated some way that it's a correction in square brackets or italics or something to indicate that this is a correction. But the old-fashioned way was you had to take the note from the margin and kind of marry it to the word with a circlet above it in the text. So this is one of the really important Masoretic notes to keep in mind, because this is where they actually really provide a difference in the text from what is actually preserved, and many of these are extremely useful. The other one to know about, just because it is so incredibly common, is this one here that we have: he gave him grace in the eyes of the prince of the guardhouse. We have here this word grace has a circlet above it in blue because it's a kind of a strange spelling. And we have over in the margin here the corresponding note for it. It is simply a lamed with a dot above it. This stands for the Aramaic word late, which means singular or unique, meaning that this word in this exact form occurs nowhere else. And you'll see that there's a lot of these. And they're just simply noting this is the only time we have this word in exactly this form. Now, there may be other grammatical forms with different prefixes or suffixes or slightly different spellings or sometimes different vowel points, but this exact form, this is the only time it shows up this way. And that's an extremely common note to have. Going back to our chapter 18 to talk a bit more about things, we've talked a bit about the Masora and the Masora Parva and the Masora Magna. Now it's time to talk about the actual critical apparatus. And if you look here, you will see that the letter A appears next to certain words. And I've got a couple circled here where we've zoomed in so you can see them well, but let's zoom out a little and take a better look at what's happening here. And the fact that it's only letter A is not significant. If there's more than one issue inside a verse, they will go on to letters B, C, D, and so forth. But it'll be a regular Latin letter that shows up in the Hebrew next to a word. And so we see here on the first one, we have the letter A after a word. Then down a few lines lower, we have two letter A's, one before a word and one after a word. This is how they indicate a segment of text. And so an entire segment here is indicated by these two A's. And then the third one I have is just simply another A after a word. Well, the way you would use this is you would look at the critical apparatus that is at the bottom of the page, and you would note that you are in chapter 18, verse 1, and that you are looking at footnote A. Then as you come down to the critical apparatus, you'll see chapter 18 is nice and big and bold there because we're starting a new chapter, and then they use commas to separate chapters and verses. Verse 1, and it says here A, CF, which is an abbreviation for confer with, then 13, 18A. Okay, they just sent us on a wild goose chase. They said there's more information about this word if you go to chapter 13, verse 18. Since they did not give us a book, we know that it is still Genesis. So we have to go to Genesis chapter 13, verse 18. Now, when we get there, we do find quite a lengthy entry on it, and it gives us information from the Greek, the Syriac, and the Vulgate. So the Greek is the Septuagint, the Syriac's the early Syriac translation, and the Vulgate is from St. Jerome, his early Latin translation. And they give us their information written in Greek, matching what is in the Septuagint, but it says it's basically the same in the Syriac and the Vulgate, indicating basically that this word should be singular. And they give this letter L there, which is for the Latin lege, which means read, or in this case, read as. And then they give us the singular form. And they say here, following chapter 12, verse 6. So they give us yet another chapter to go look at, chapter 12, verse 6. And in chapter 12, verse 6, it does have this word show up in the singular, and that's where they're basing some of this on. But then it also tells us to also confer chapter 14, verse 13, and chapter 18, verse 1, which is where we started all this from, as well as Deuteronomy 11:30. So now we've got all sorts of things to look at. And then they have here this interesting note that this fancy looking M, and I apologize, the PDF's a little rough. That is a fancy looking Gothic style M there, which stands for the Masoretic text. So the Masoretic text, semper, meaning always, PL plural. So in the Masoretic text, this word is always plural. But in the Septuagint, the Syriac, and the Vulgate, singular. And then the double lines tell us that's the end of the case. What follows is another reference. So that is chapter 13, verse 18's notes that we were referred to, that you had to go flip back to there, and then it will tell you to go back to 12, verse 6, and then confer it with one other place, and then a place over in Deuteronomy to fully understand what's happening. That's a lot of chasing down. But this is how we understand what this word means. And it's a fairly important one. It has to do with sacred trees, and that this is the Lord appeared in the sacred tree of Mamre. And this is sometimes translated as plains of Mamre, but the word actually seems to mean an oak tree, a sacred tree. And that's far more of a rabbit hole than I want to go down for this video. But this is the kind of stuff that we get is, was it trees, plural, or was it a singular sacred tree? And this is what this is talking about. Now, this story here in chapter 18 is the story of the three messengers who come to visit Abraham. And that takes us to verse 3, where we have this segment that is marked off by the letter A. And here, if we look at the critical apparatus, it's a little easier to read, maybe, where it says A-A, meaning this is a section. So we have A-A rather than just A. And we have three little loop-de-loops. Those stand for the Samaritan Hebrew Pentateuch. This is a copy of the 5 books of Moses that was kept by the Samaritans as opposed to the Jews. And it is largely the same, but it has some differences. And what is the main difference here is that the Masoretic text has these 3 words in this segment here as a second person singular, in your eyes. And the Samaritan Pentateuch has them as a second person plural, which in English is also in your eyes. We don't really do singulars versus plural in English that much. Old English, you would have had thy versus your. But yeah, the question is, are we talking about a single individual, or are we talking about multiple individuals? And since this is 3 people visiting, we would actually expect it to be the plural, but Masoretic text has the singular, which leads to some confusion, and the fact that the Samaritan Pentateuch has differently is interesting. But this is a little bit of the puzzle that you get to put together. Going forward a little bit more to verse 5 and footnote A there, we have a bit more code. We have the letters PC, which is Pauki, meaning a few. What I have shown here is actually just from one of these helper books showing what these mean in English. So the Genesis 1:11, that really isn't relevant here. It's just giving an example of where this abbreviation occurs. But it's saying a few, MSS. MSS, or MS for singular, is one of several medieval manuscripts of the Hebrew Old Testament. So this is saying a few manuscripts. These are handwritten manuscripts as opposed to printed manuscripts, which are referred to as editions, EDD. So a few handwritten manuscripts and the Samaritan Pentateuch, those 3 loop-de-loops again, and the Greek Septuagint, and the Syriac, and the Targums, which are the Aramaic translations. And we have a little exponent J there, superscript J, which tells us that this is Targum Pseudo-Jonathan particularly. So it is a specific Targum translation of the Old Testament that's being referenced here. So what do all these references tell us? That we have a few handwritten manuscripts and 4 different languages of translation, early translations that all have something different. Well, for that, you have to drop to the next line here where we find out that they all have what appears to be the equivalent of a vav at the front of this word, which is the conjunction and. So in the Masoretic text, there is no conjunction and here, but it's telling us in just about everything else, there is. And so this is a strong indication that the conjunction and has been lost during copying. And this is what a critical apparatus is and what it does. As you can see, it's a lot of work to figure it out. It gets very confusing. There are others that we could talk about here, such as footnote 6a, which tells us that this is missing from the Greek Septuagint. Footnote A on verse 9, which is with no textual witness support at all, just the editors of BHS telling us that perhaps this should be read with this other similar word in its place. This is their editorial suggestion of what they think might be appropriate to amend the text. Sometimes these are quite valuable, sometimes they're easily dismissed. But there's a number of things that come up in these case notes in the critical apparatus that are throughout. So what is the alternative to this interesting system here? Well, I mentioned that there is a new edition coming out, Biblia Hebraica Quinta, BHQ, and it has fixed a lot of these problems. When BHS was first put out, there was a lot of concern over trying to get as much information into as small a space as possible. And so everything is a bit cryptic, everything is abbreviated, and it was expected that a serious scholar would learn these abbreviations and symbols in order to use the resource. Well, with BHQ coming out, they realized that they don't have to be so compact. Printing has changed entirely. Now we have computers and we can make much longer books, and they've been releasing in volumes slowly and behind schedule different books of the Hebrew Bible. And this is from Genesis, the equivalent chapter 18 page. These small letters are gone. So all the little A's that we saw there, no more, or any of the other Latin letters that tell you where you're going. Now, if you want to look at things, you'll notice that there's still 2 apparatuses below. One is the actual Masora Magna, that is not just a reference to another volume, but the actual notes that appear in the Leningrad Codex are right there on the page at the bottom of the page. So that's there. Also, they'll have below that the critical apparatus, which is quite expanded and just simply uses the Hebrew word that was from the verse. So let's take a look at what that first footnote on 18.1 looks like. If we come down to the critical apparatus here, I highlighted in blue the note on 18.1. And if you remember, this is the one just simply told us to confer with an earlier chapter in Genesis. Now we have here the words in the oaks of Mamre there in Hebrew, and it then tells us that the Samaritan Pentateuch reads the same way, something that was not in our previous information. And then we have a bar. The single bar means now we're going to look at readings that disagree. So first we had readings that agree. Obviously the Leningrad Codex reads this way, but the Samaritan Pentateuch also reads this way. Then we have a bar for alternate readings, and then it gives us the Greek that we had to go look up elsewhere and tells us, not with a fancy letter G, but with just a good old letter G, that the Septuagint is this reading here. And then it also tells us that the Syriac, which again is just a normal letter S, agrees with this singular reading. Then it tells us that they believe that this was to harmonize it with chapter 12, verse 6. So it also gives an opinion as to why they differ, that it was to make harmony between chapter 12, verse 6 and this verse. Then they have another pipe, meaning that there's yet another reading, and this is in the plains of Mamre, and that's what the Vulgate has, as well as the Targum Onkelos, which is the capital T with the O exponent there, that were made for theological reasons. They didn't want a sacred tree being involved here. And then they have another pipe, and they have what the Targum Pseudo Jonathan has. And then they have another pipe, and they have what 2 other Targums have. Then they have here the double pipe, meaning that's the end of the cases, but then they have this little fancy looking plus symbol that I highlighted in red here. This means there's more on it still. And it tells you to go look in the appendix for chapter 12, verse 6 under Elon More. Okay, well, there are 3 appendices to this volume. One of them is the appendice to the critical apparatus. And if we go look up 12 verse 6, we then have this entry. We have a nice full paragraph with English and explanation that is generally readable about this word and how it means oak tree and what has been thought about that, and other verses that are important to consider, and other textual witnesses that are there to be considered as well. All sorts of details for you to dig in and get to the bottom of what's really happening with this word. This is all information that we did not have in BHS, and it's all there in BHQ. Beautiful, detailed. And the other 2 appendices that I want to point out here is there's also an appendice for the Masora Parva, which takes all of those hard to read abbreviations and gives us explanations as to what they mean. And so this is an example of what we have for the Masora Parva notes around chapter 18, all this great detail telling us exactly how to read them. And then for the Masora Magna, which you saw was produced at the bottom of the page, we then have an appendice that also talks about it. And this is what we find in the Masora Magna. It's explained here in this other appendice. So we have all of that explained for us in BHQ. As you can see, BHQ is a major step forward from BHS, and it is a lovely addition. There are 9 volumes that are available for it right now. You can buy them in hard copy off of Amazon as well as other places. In no particular order, they are Genesis, Job, which is the newest one, the 5 Megillot, which is Ruth, Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes, Lamentation, and Esther, the 12 Minor Prophets, the book of Deuteronomy, the book of Leviticus, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, the book of Proverbs, and the book of Judges. So if you're interested in any of those books, you can buy the BHQ in hard copy from Amazon. They vary a bit, but most of them are around $60 to $70 a piece. So they're not cheap. But what you may want to consider is that an electronic copy is really useful. Now, unfortunately, electronic copies are not perfect. They have some limitations and some errors to them. So I don't want to make you feel like it is the end all be all of everything. But the electronic copy is pretty nifty because you can take the various appendices and the text and link it all together. So it's very easy to be reading the text and having the appendices open right beside it, and to be able to scroll in one and have it scroll in the others. It all works very nicely, but it ain't cheap. There are 2 major electronic copies that I am aware of. If you know of any others, please let me know in the comments. The one I use is from Accordance, and I like Accordance. It's good software, but I must admit it is struggling a bit, as are many places that do software with this is a very niche category, and they don't have a very big customer base, and they are struggling to stay alive as a company. And so who knows what their future holds. I wish them the best. I hope they continue to make good software. Their software is a little bit dated. I would love to see it in more of a web format, which I know they're working on. It has formats for Android and iOS, but they're kind of pathetic. But it is what it is. It's still probably the best software I know of for this type of thing, and I use it extensively, and I enjoy it very much. I very much hope that they survive and prosper. The other place that sells it is Logos. Logos only has 8 of the 9 volumes that are available. Both of them have a similar price, which is generally going to be around $300 to $400 if you want to buy all of them. So this is, again, not a cheap investment. But if you're serious about it, it is quite a useful investment to get the full quality of the BHQ. So now I've spent much longer than I wanted to explaining this, but as you can see, it's a very complex topic. If you don't read Hebrew, I hope this at least gave you an insight into the complexities involved when we say, can you translate this verse? Or how do you reconstruct this verse? This is all stuff that goes into it. And I haven't even gotten into how these different sources relate to each other as to when they were composed and what they can tell us and what they can't tell us. I will mention here two honorable mentions of other projects that sort of compete with Biblia Hebraica, but they've both kind of fizzled. One of them is the Oxford Hebrew Bible. It started out with the idea of making an eclectic text rather than a diplomatic text. Rather than basing it on a single manuscript, they decided to try and give the best reading from any manuscript and put it together into one document and then make references off of that. The problem is most of their reconstructions were extremely speculative and nobody could really decide what something originally said or which reading was really best. And so it became a very opinionated and not very scholarly work, and it kind of got ripped to shreds by a lot of very reputable biblical scholars, including Emmanuel Tove, who had some unkind things to say about it. And Oxford kind of stepped away from the whole thing, dropped it like a hot potato, and it was then picked up by the Society for Biblical Literature and renamed as the Hebrew Bible Critical Edition. And then the SBL wound up getting into a fight with everyone, including the editor. And now if you go to look at it, you get a 404 page not found. I would not be holding my breath for it to produce anything of substance anytime soon. I believe they had one volume that got out. It's really hard to find, and it's not really worth it, honestly. It wasn't anything groundbreaking or profound. A much better effort was made by Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and they wanted to do for the Aleppo Codex what BHS did for the Leningrad Codex, a very noble effort. And it was led by a very small team with a lot of ambition. And it's been working since 1956 and hasn't gotten done yet. So I don't think it's going to be producing much either. It's been a very long time since they really produced a volume out of there. They have a couple of volumes that are out, including a volume on Isaiah, which BHQ does not have yet. But honestly, their volume on Isaiah doesn't give me really anything that I can't get from BHS, and BHS is much more accessible. So it was a noble effort, but it seems to have been underfunded and with too small a team to complete its goals. And now it's been an insanely long time that it's been going on. And I don't think it's going to actually ever come to completion. So really, BHS is the only game in town right now for a complete coverage of the Hebrew Bible. And BHQ is a very intriguing and superior product for people who really want a great system that covers half of the Hebrew Bible or so, maybe more of a third of the Hebrew Bible. So that's where it stands today. If you are interested in textual criticism and learning how all the different handwritten copies of the Bible interrelate and how they differ, this is where you go. Anyway, that's all we've got for today. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you found it insightful. Give me a like and a subscribe. See you in the next one.